Very interesting. He buys a slave, and luckily for this 14-year-old slave girl, she is bought by this wonderful person who makes love with her on the beach, and who is so in love with her, and she behaves, of course, like the Oriental prototype. She's not a real individual, but she is invented after images that Lane Fox knows. For instance, these fertility statues that are found everywhere in the East, which is also as far as his knowledge goes of the Orient. I mean, we have to be fair, he doesn't know anything about it, so this is what he knows, so this is what he uses in the story. And then he continues, because it gets better even. When he returned, she would lie with him and tell him stories of how her family had once been kings of Carchemish, but Assyrians had sold her mother into slavery at Kinalua on the Orontes. So it's actually the Assyrians, the evil Assyrians, that have made her a slave. And also, think of this, she has had a better past. She once was a princess, you know, it's always the same. Once there was a better past, but now she's a slave, but she has not been made a slave by the Greeks. No, he just bought her. No, he doesn't make her a slave, this is what the Assyrians do. Brought to the Orontes when she had been brought for sale at Atta by the sea. On stormy nights, she told him the stories of the gods on the mountain Hazi, between which they lay, the gods. She had sung them in choirs as a girl on the hill slopes, the song of kingship and the song of the sea. There were stories of the battles by which Tahunta Zeus had come to reign in heaven, and of the great castrator which had once parted heaven from earth, in a way, she promised, in which she would never part him from her. This is also quite interesting, because there is indeed a very old Greek myth about the parting of heaven and earth by a castration, but this is done by a male god. And he subtly, or not so subtly, changes this into the Oriental woman, you know, making an allusion to this, that she will of course not do this, but there is a threat of doing that in the story, obviously. So I think that that all of this is pretty clear, but what is, I think, even for the author, for Lane Fox himself, not consciously clear, is what her role really is in this story. Because after this, he tells us that self-satisfied, as he calls it, self-satisfied Assyrian officers arrive, and they demand tribute. And so Hipposthenes and his Anas, they leave the Levant, and they go to places where people are less aggressive. I mean, he doesn't hide his preference, of course. And once arriving in a Greek colony in Italy, she gives birth to a son, but he dies after 3 months. They then return to Greece, and at some point a war breaks out between two city-states, and then he concludes by this passage: the day after, it was back to the battlefield, with Hipposthenes mounting on his fiery horse, Phosphorus. It means light bringer, also not a coincidence. His bronze North Syrian harness fixed for him by Anas, his long hair flowing on the back of his head in true Abantic Euboean fashion, and a fine Chalcidian sword in his hands. He rode into battle, reliving the value of an epic hero, no longer the sailor, but the warrior in combat. He died, killed by an illicit Eritrean archer, but his life had combined the ideals of the Iliad and the Odyssey, uniting valor and cunning, shown in combat and journeys by sea. And of course, as you may imagine, Robin Lane Fox is the true traveling hero of this story. I think it's very clear that he imagines himself in this. So in a way, he's very present in this story, and his preferences are very present in this story. And I also think that being an Oxford historian, a lot of this is ironic and tongue-in-cheek. I mean, you don't have to take all of this serious. It's more the unconscious part in it that I find really worrying, and that is the fact that this Anas, this 14-year-old slave girl who is so happy to make love on the beach with the guy who buys her, she gives him a son, but he dies after 3 months. So the marriage remains barren in a way. And Oriental women can never produce a real son. I mean, this is a very, very old cliché. And not only that, but after that he has died in this heroic way with his long blonde hair waving in the wind, she dies too. After 8 days she dies because she cannot overcome her grief. She cannot exist without him. Think of it is almost too good to be true that Lane Fox gives us this, because it's so Orientalist. This Anas has never existed as a real individual, as a real person. She is absolutely nothing. She's a phantom. And when the true hero of the story, the real individual, the Greek with his waving hair, when he disappears from the theater, she automatically vanishes too, because she's nothing. She is a phantom. She's a construct. She's just, you know, his counter-image and nothing more. And then, to make it worse, both of them, of course, have to be buried, and they are buried separately. He is cremated in Greek fashion, and she is buried in a jar in Syrian Levantine fashion of the day. So even in that, they remain separated. So although he's talking about Greeks uniting with Oriental women and taking back all these stories, there is no real unification at all. There's no offspring from it, and there's also no intellectual unification. They remain separate. And I think that it is these unconscious layers in the story that are really worrying. This is not the ironic Lane Fox, but this is Lane Fox writing this down automatically. And this is something to keep in mind. So these things happen, you know, and they are new, they are recent. And it's quite stunning, you know, when you then go back, for instance, to the late 19th century, a famous German classicist, historian of Greek and Roman civilizations, Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff. But he writes about the Phoenicians, who have not given anything to Greek culture. It's exactly the same attitude. It's all over again. They are just the Schosskinder des modernen Philosemitismus. This was in the days that to be a friend of the Semites was something very bad, and to be an anti-Semite was something very good. And the Phoenician culture is not self-sufficient. You know, it cannot exist on its own. And the last citation, which is really very vicious, vitriolic, I should say, die seit Jahrhunderte faulende Völker und Staaten der Semiten und Ägypter, die den Hellenen trotz ihrer alten Kultur nichts hatten abgeben können, als ein paar Handfertigkeiten und Techniken, abgeschmackte Trachten und Geräte, sopfige Ornamente, widerliche Fetische für noch widerliche Götzen. He's almost spitting out his anger that there are people who can believe that the Phoenicians gave something to his Greek culture, because it is very much his culture, his image of Greek culture, that was so important for Germany in the 19th century. The young German state, the unified German state, really identified very much with the Greek city-states and with the ideals of the Greek city-state. And they could not manage, you know, a Greek culture that was influenced or even formed by cultural traditions from the East. This was unthinkable. This was absolutely unthinkable. Not because of the Greeks, but because of the Germans. So, understandable in this 19th century context, and again, I'm not saying that Wilamowitz, although I think he really was very vicious as a person, but still I wouldn't say that he was the champion of anti-Semitism, or that he paved the way for Hitler or whatever. I mean, it would be foolish to say so. But it is worrying that these streams of thought, even unconsciously, occur also in this book from 2008 by Robin Lane Fox. And he, as I said, he's not the only one. So, now I make things more complicated again. This is from the first excavation report of the city of Susa in southwestern Iran, the first French excavations. And in the first part of the first volume of a long series of excavation reports, there's actually not evidence from the excavations, but it's a kind of survey, sort of ethnic survey that they did in the region. So they went all the way from northern Lorestan, I think, all the way to Bandar Abbas, and everything in between was sort of mapped ethnically. So they identified ethnic types, which again was normal in those days. I mean, as absurd as it sounds to us now, I mean, they really were measuring people's foreheads, literally, people's foreheads. You know, you have two types, the short ones and the high ones. And of course, the high ones are the Aryans and the short ones are the non-Aryans. I mean, it's all very simple and it works really well, because even when you have people with a sort of middle type forehead, then they come from a mixed family, so it always works. So he collects a mass of data, and then he compares that to the skulls that he finds in his excavation, and he concludes from that that the Elamites who lived in Susa, and in his mind came from the Zagros to the east of Susa, that they were of an African race, Negroids as he calls them. And later there is of course the migration of the Aryans, and you get some mixed forms, but basically in Iran you have these original Africans, and then later the Aryans coming. Now we jump to 1964, Wouter Henkelman, very famous scholar of ancient Iranian history. And he looks at the famous guards, the Persian guards, excavated by the French in Susa. These are panels from glazed bricks and reconstructed in Paris in the Louvre. And he says, well, it's very clear that King Darius, who made these panels, he wanted to represent three races. And I mean, I can't see it, but for him, for Wouter Henkelman, this was very clear. He says, of course, the first one is brown, and he must be a mountain Elamite. And then the second one is black, so he must be an Elamite from the plain. And the third one, obviously, is white, so obviously he is a Persian. So it's, I mean, this is all, these things work always. It works always. So Henkelman also, and Henkelman of course, maybe you know this, he had a very particular history. After the war, he couldn't publish for 5 years, and there was a good reason for this, because he was a quite active member of the SS, and he wrote some really horrible things. But in this context, he is of course clever enough not to pronounce a verdict. He just says there are these races. He actually does talk about races, and also about pure races and mixed races, but he doesn't say anything about the inferiority of the black Elamites, which, by the way, were his lifelong subject of interest. He is one of the most prolific scholars for the Elamite civilization. But then he goes on, and this is from an article in 1972, and we'll just summarize this. He says at some point the Indo-Europeans, the Indo-Iranians, the Aryans as they were called in those days, they came into Iran. This, by the way, is a theory which is now very problematic. We don't believe in a massive migration anymore, and archaeologists are completely against this. But in those days people still believed it, and he actually thought that he could date it exactly to 700 BC. You know, suddenly on Thursday morning there was a dust cloud. You know, people were asking what's going on. It was, of course, the Aryans. And so they go into Fars, but there is already a population there, because not only in the region around Susa, Khuzestan, but also in Fars, there had been Elamites, this old population. And then the Persians, they settle and they build Takht Jamshid, Persepolis, and they have an administration there with clay tablets, and the clay tablets that are written in Elamite language. And Henkelman, of course, has to explain this. Why on earth are these victorious Aryans using Elamite? Well, then he comes up with a solution that the Persians didn't want to write themselves, because they were the herrscher, they were not inclined to be clerks, so they used the Elamites for that. And then the next question is, But then there's a problem, because the Elamites have this weird language, this non-Indo-European language, this really weird language. And how did they understand the Elamites? Because if the Elamites were doing their administration, they could of course trick the Persians all the time. So how did the Persians check on them? Well, here he has an ingenious solution, because there are still these Elamites in Fars, and he says, sie, that's the Iranians, the Persians, sie hatten elamische Knechte, Hausdiener und Ammen. They had Elamite slaves and servants and nurses at home. And because of this, because they had to talk with their personnel, they knew a little bit of Elamite, and this is how they checked, also on their scribes. And now, reflect, this is the same guy who thinks of the Elamites as blacks. This is apartheid. He is basically describing apartheid, There is this old population, and they are black. He says so himself. And they are colonized by these wonderful Aryans with their hyperculture, and they are degraded, and they deserve nothing better, because their culture is ridiculous and their language is ridiculous. They are brought back to the level of servants and nurses, and their only role in history is to serve this wonderful new culture. So here you can see that Orientalism works in many different directions. Can also work, within scholarship on different population groups within the Orient. You see that things really are very complicated. And the other thing that complicates this particular example is that, as opposed to, for instance, the Arabs that are often the subject of Orientalism, as if you can talk about the Arabs, but of course Orientalism does. As opposed to that, the Elamites cannot talk back. There has been an enormous reaction, of course, from the Near East to Orientalist attitudes, and I think there's now a real international discourse about it. But that will never happen with the poor Elamites. Never. They are defenseless, and this is also the reason why even now, even the pupils of Wouter Henkelman keep repeating this, and why the Elamites in scholarship are still being portrayed as really strange. It's a field. It is actually my field, so that's why I get really pissed off when I read things like this. It's a very small field. It's maximally 20 people on the globe that professionally work on the Elamites, and that means that the field is too small to cleanse itself of strange ideas like this. It doesn't have a critical mass like Greek history. And these 20 people, by the way, they all hate each other. Some of them even live, in the same street and don't talk. I mean, it's quite bad. So these 20 people, they of course have a responsibility vis-à-vis these poor Elamites, because these Elamites cannot speak back. And they really are the victim of Orientalist attitudes, like propounded here by Wouter Henkelman. And this, I think, is one of the real essences and the real deep problems of Orientalism. And here I really differ from Said. I think that it is in a historical period that Orientalism is the most fierce. When you talk about people in the past, because they cannot talk back, you can make them whatever you want. Really, it's a super form of Orientalism. So it really is, I think, a matter of engaging humanism to go into these historical periods and to deconstruct visions like this, which in my view are really colonial, if not racist. So now I will skip a few things because I don't want to bore you forever. This is actually Said saying that that every encounter with the past of the East, so for instance reconstructing a dead language, in a way is an Orientalist attitude, because you're reconstructing the Orient, and we are doing it. We are making this theater. And as I said before, I think here he goes too far And I wanted to discuss with you an example from the early 19th century, the Fundgruben des Orients, also it's published in 2 languages, also published as the Mine de l'Orient, which was a very idealistic project in Vienna, where everything from the Orient that had relevance to the West, but also everything from the West with relevance to the Orient was discussed in a way that was, I think, very illuminated, especially for the time, and with a great ideal in it. Taken from Goethe, who took it from the Quran, of course. It's famously used in the Westöstlicher Divan of Goethe. Sag, Gottes ist der Orient und Gottes ist der Occident. It's of course very well known, and they took it as their motto. They took it as their motto, as a real world vision, a universalist approach to East and West. And this is 1809 that they started doing this. Maybe, not coincidentally, in Vienna, of course, the capital of a very multi-ethnic, multicultural empire that was also exposed much more and much earlier than England to the East. So this might be a reason for the openness that you see here. And I should add to this that Said doesn't discuss Austria or Germany at all in his book. It basically is about England and France. So that might explain why he hasn't seen this. But I will skip this. And this beautiful saying by the founder of this society. And now go very briefly, because my time is running out, and you must be so tired by now. Very briefly to the decipherment of cuneiform, because one of the things that Said keeps repeating, and we have seen this last week, is that the Orient is silent. It's the silent order. It doesn't speak for itself. It doesn't have a voice for itself, and we write the scenario. We say what the Orient has to say, and the Orient will never have a message of its own. Well, if you know that, as Said, then I think you should have acknowledged, of course, that those same people, those same scholars that had these Orientalist attitudes were also responsible for giving the Orient a voice, because they really did. This is the famous inscription and relief of King Darius the Great at Bisutun in northern Iran, and it was deciphered in the 19th century by Henry Rawlinson, a British officer who in 1847 published an article in which he announced the decipherment of one of the versions of this inscription. And by doing so, the other versions were Babylonian and Elamite could also be read, and that in turn meant that the thousands, tens of thousands, and in the end even hundreds of thousands of clay tablets in Western museums could finally be read. And suddenly the Orient had a voice, and it spoke with an ancient voice, a voice that was going back to 3400 BC, and with amazing thoughts, unexpected stories, and stories that shook the European self-conscious, because, for instance, they destroyed the idea that the Bible was the oldest tradition. They had much older stories that were parallel to that in the Bible. And I will talk about that in the April session. So this person, and of course he's part of a larger group of scholars who worked on this, eminently contributed to the emancipation of the Orient, even if he didn't want to, because as a politician later in his life, he was quite awful. I mean, he was absolutely, for instance, for the occupation of Afghanistan, he was very, very active and very aggressive in his political uttering. So all these things are quite ambivalent. And I must say that, I mean, being raised in, as I told you last time, in a sort of anti-Orientalist atmosphere by my teachers, I sometimes myself have doubts about my work. I mean, I am making a new edition of the same inscription, and it is simply a fact that for the Elamite version there are no people in Iran who could do that. It's simply a fact. It's something that I deplore, but it also makes me, in a way, it makes me uncomfortable. It really makes me uncomfortable, because I don't want to go into Iran and, so to speak, as Said would call me, doubtlessly colonialized the past of Iran by taking it, by saying this is your past, this is how it should be, and I, for you, will read this inscription, tell you how to read it. I have, of course I think about it. And in the same way, when I teach in Iran, I think about that same aspect. Why am I coming into Iran and I'm telling you something? So I'm exposing you to these private emotions because my way of dealing with it is at least imagining that I generate a dialogue by doing this. By teaching, I create a group of students with whom I can work, and by opening these sources I make it possible for other people to work with them, but especially by bringing myself into Iran, I bring myself into contact with a part of this history that is a living history. For people in Europe, Elamites and other languages like Elamite at best are an interesting hobby, and at worst they are a waste of taxpayers' money. But in Iran it's part of a living past, and it's also, even, at least potentially, part of a very interesting debate, for instance about Persian-Iranian identity. How far does it go back? I mean, I've given a lecture in Tehran about Elamite culture as an Iranian culture, and this really generated a very interesting discussion, I think. So for me, this is the way forward, to not to be afraid to step into this discussion, but it really has to be a real debate. And I think that archaeologists generally are much better in engaging with people from the Near East, with colleagues from the Near East, and work in joint projects. And I think that philologists and historians should follow that example, because these worlds are still much too much separated, and a lot can be gained by changing that. Okay.